Welcome back, my friends, to a brand new season of In the Crease. I'm your host, JE and it is an absolute honor to have you here kicking off season 4. And if you're tuning in after the one, the only Corin Nimmick's awesome show, I appreciate it. I'm actually going to, I'm not going to say touch on a similar subject, but right along the same path, it seems. Now, if you've been with us before, I try not to bring lectures. We try to dive headfirst into some of the mysteries, some legends, histories, battles. We may have our sword drawn, our shield raised, and often we'll usually have a nice cold beer in our hand while we do it. And today, we're going to talk about one of the most epic sieges in human history, battle for the very future of Christian Europe hung by a thread. A story where a handful of warrior monks, fishermen, townspeople all stood alone against what was then one of the mightiest, if not the mightiest, empire on earth. It is a story of faith, of courage, and the kind of stubbornness that can move mountains, or, in this case, stop an empire cold. So go grab your drink of choice, your rosary if you want, and probably a sword. You're going to probably need all three, for this is the Siege of Malta. A picture the Mediterranean Sea in 1565. The sun is rising over endless blue waters. Seagulls are riding the thermals. The smell of salt and citrus is in the air. Fishing boats are bobbing lazily along the harbors. Somewhere out beyond the horizon, danger. Now, in the east, the sprawling might of the Ottoman Empire, the largest and most fearsome force on the planet at the time, is flexing its muscles, eager conquest. In the west, you have Christian Europe, fractured, uncertain, and trembling. And perched between them, a tiny speck of a rock called Malta. About the size of a mid-sized country fair, albeit usually with more cannons, and definitely usually way more rosaries. Malta really wasn't much to look at. Rugged, rocky, windswept. It had a few scattered villages, some livestock, a couple fortified towns clinging to its craggy coastline. But strategically, Malta was everything. The dagger pointed straight at the heart of the Ottoman naval power in the Mediterranean. It was a launch pad. It was a roadblock. It was a statement. You shall not pass! And right there, holding the line, were the Knights of St. John, the Hospitallers, warrior monks who had spent centuries battling in the Crusades. They weren't just professional soldiers. They were holy warriors, sworn to poverty, chastity, obedience, and stabbing heretics in the face when necessary. For the Lord. At the head of the order stood Jean Pesot de Villiers, nearly 70 years old, short, weathered, as tough as a $2 steak left out in the Maltese sun. This man wasn't made in a palace. He was made in blood and salt water. Captured as a young knight, he spent a year chained to an Ottoman galley, rowing 20 hours a day under a taskmaster's whip. He survived, and he never forgot. When he became Grand Master, de Villiers knew Malta was a target. He knew the Ottomans weren't done. And he spent every waking hour preparing for the storm he saw coming long before anyone else did. He rebuilt fortifications. He stockpiled grain, water, ammunition. He trained his knights and militia not just to fight, but to endure. Because he understood something the world had forgotten. Victory doesn't go to the biggest army. It goes to the last man standing. Meanwhile, back in Constantinople, the Sultan had his own ace up his sleeve. His name was Dragut, the drawn sword of Islam. If you mixed, say, Blackbeard, Hannibal, and probably an angry grizzly bear, you'd probably get close to this gentleman. He wasn't just a pirate, he was a living legend. He had burned coastal cities to the ground, captured fortresses everyone else thought impregnable, and made the Mediterranean his personal playground. When Dragut said jump, the sea itself would flinch. And now? Well, now he had Malta in his sights. This wasn't just going to be another raid. This was going to be an extermination. Now, a little bit of a timeout here, because it's important you may get a little bit of a bigger picture. Like I said, the Siege of Malta wasn't some random island scrap. It was the front line in a global struggle between Christianity and Islam. The Ottomans had already gobbled up Constantinople. They steamrolled across Greece, the Balkans, most of Hungary. They laid siege to Vienna once already, and they weren't done. If Malta fell, Sicily would fall next. And after Sicily, you'd have Italy, Spain, France, and maybe even England itself. The Pope knew it. The kings of Europe knew it. Even Elizabeth I, sitting in Protestant England, admitted that if Malta went, the whole continent could go up in flames. It really was that serious. The spring of 1565. The order spies in Constantinople start hearing whispers. A fleet is assembling. Thousands of soldiers are gathering. Siege guns being loaded, and the name on everyone's lips was Malta. Grandmaster de Valette got word of this, and he knows this is it. He sends out urgent summons across Europe. Come to Malta's defense, send men, send guns, send ships. Europe responded with a shrug. Spain promises to send help. Eventually. Maybe. When they get around to it. The Papal States wring their hands. The French, the French are just too busy fighting each other. It's like your house is on fire, and your neighbors are all standing outside arguing about whose hose is bigger. Malta is going to be on its own. So the tiny island braces for the storm. On the ramparts of Burgoo, Singlet, Fort St. Elmo, old cannons are polished, walls are patched, and boys barely old enough to hold a sword drill with sticks. In the town squares, priests are leading public prayers. Rosaries are clutched tight. Families huddled together at night, listening for the distant thunder of would-be enemy guns. They know what's coming. And still, they're choosing to stand. Then, on May 18th, 1565, Maltese lookouts standing atop the limestone cliff spot sails on the horizon. Not just a few ships, not even a dozen. Hundreds of ships. An entire city of war afloat and bearing down on them. Galleys, galleons, supply ships, troop carriers, flags snapping in the Mediterranean wind. Red crescent banners shining in the sunlight. A true juggernaut. It is said that the sea itself seemed to darken under the mass of this fleet. The Ottoman invasion force, no other way to put it, is colossal. Contemporary reports claimed 40,000 men. Special units, the cavalry, the heavy artillery crews, corsairs, even irregular infantry. Now, of course, modern historians debate these numbers, but even that, 25 to 30,000, is still enough to make you rethink your life choices. On Malta side, about 6,000 defenders total, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. But only 500 of them are actual knights. The rest, well, they're mercenaries, local militia, villagers with rusty muskets and kitchen knives. This is real David and Goliath hours. The Ottoman fleet drops anchor at the bay. The soldiers disembark. A living tide of men, horses, cannons, siege towers, trenches, tents. You have Ottoman engineers that start drawing up plans. Mustafa Pasha, an army commander, and Piali Pasha, the admiral, confer over maps. Their target is, of course, obvious. Fort St. Elmo, which is guarding the entrance to the Grand Harbor itself. If you take Elmo, the rest of Malta will fall like dominoes. Dragut, arriving late with his corsairs, agrees. They're going to crack open Malta like a crab shell. They're going to stomp the knights into the dirt. Well, that was the plan. Meanwhile, inside the walls of Burgu and Singlea, the Grand Master gathers his men. He looks them in the eyes. He knows most of them will not survive. He knows he himself might not live to see another sunrise. And still, he stands before them with an unshakable certainty of a man who has already made peace with God. It is not walls that defend a city, he tells them. It is the men who stand upon them. And so it begins. The greatest siege of the 16th century. A test not just of arms, but of faith. The fate of Malta, the fate of Europe, the fate of Christianity itself. Will it be decided on these sun-baked rocks by a few thousand brave souls who refuse to kneel? The guns would open up on May 24th, 1565. A deep rumble that rolled across the island like distant thunder. The Ottoman cannons had spoken, and their message was clear. Surrender or be buried here. Fort St. Elmo, a small star-shaped fort jutting out onto the rocky peninsula at the mouth of the Grand Harbor, was about to become the most brutal, bloody, and stubbornly heroic battleground of the entire siege. The Ottomans believed they would take it in a week. It held for over a month. It cost them their best soldiers, their greatest admiral, and some would say their chance at victory. Now, once again, numbers are not always accurate. We're going by contemporary letters and notes, but they vary from time to time. And inside St. Elmo's battered walls stood 120 Knights of St. John and an additional 500 soldiers, Spanish, Italian, and Maltese militia. Really, for the most part, ordinary men facing extraordinary odds. Every day, under an unrelenting sun, they endured a hurricane of steel. The Ottomans had dragged over 60 siege guns into position, pounding St. Elmo from three sides. The air was a storm of stone splinters, dust, and flying iron. The ground would shake like an earthquake. Walls would crumble faster than they could even be repaired. Yet still, they fought. Every night, under cover of darkness, small boats ferried reinforcements and supplies across the Grand Harbor from Burgu. volunteers, because everyone knew what St. Elmo had become, a death sentence. These were not men who counted their lives too dearly. These were knights who had sworn oaths. They meant it. Among them was Commander Mathurin Remigas, a Corsican knight who had already built a reputation for fearless, almost reckless raids against the Ottomans. A man so stubborn that when he asked what his plan was if the Turks broke through the wall, he supposedly just grinned and said, "Then we kill them inside as well." Sometimes simple plans are the best plans. Now, the Ottomans, they tried everything. Mass bombardments, direct assaults, tunnel attacks, scaling ladders, fire ships sent against the harbor walls. And every time, the defenders threw them back. By June, Dragut himself had arrived on the scene. The living legend was here. The man the Christian world feared like the coming of the third plague. He looked at the battered wreckage of Fort St. Elmo, barely more at this point than a pile of stones at this point, and just sneered. "This should have been over weeks ago," he would proclaim. But turns out, throwing rocks at monks wasn't as easy as it looked. Dragut personally supervised the artillery. He adjusted the cannon placements. He ordered new trenches dug. He was determined to finish the job. It would be the last siege he ever commanded. For on June 18th, while directing siege operations, Dragut was struck in the head by a flying shard of masonry. Now, accounts vary. Some say it was from Ottoman friendly fire. Others claim it was actually a lucky shot from Fort St. Angelo across the harbor. Either way, the terror of the Mediterranean was mortally wounded. He did linger for days, raging, cursing, and then he died. Now, imagine being the best siege commander on Earth, then getting bunked into oblivion by a chunk of limestone shot from a fort that was supposed to be dead 2 weeks ago. Advanced Ottoman tactics. Die to random criticals. It's actually kind of poetic in a way. But even without Dragut, the Ottomans would press harder. By the 23rd, St. Elmo was a ruin. The walls were gone. The defenses shattered. The men inside wounded, dying, exhausted, yet refusing to yield. They would make confession that morning. They received communion. They would kiss their swords and their cross and took their places on the rubble, knowing it would be for the last time. And the Ottomans launched their final assault. Waves of Janissary surged over the shattered ramparts. Hand-to-hand combat erupted in ruins. Pike against sword. Dagger against musket butt. Knights bleeding from half a dozen wounds, still fighting 2 or 3 men at a time. Every foot of ground, men would die screaming. It's kind of unfair to call it a war. It was a slaughter. And still, the knights made the Ottomans pay for every inch. Until finally, there were no more defenders left to fight. Fort St. Elmo fell. The Ottoman banner rose over a mountain of corpses. Not one knight escaped alive. A few severely wounded survivors were dragged away in chains, only to be tortured and summarily executed shortly thereafter. It had taken the Ottoman Empire 4 full weeks and the lives of over 6,000 of their best soldiers to conquer a single ruined fort defended by a few hundred starving, bleeding men. They technically won, but it was at a cost that would end up haunting them for the rest of the siege. Enraged by a stubborn resistance, Mustafa Pasha ordered a gruesome message sent to the remaining defenders in Burgu and Singlea. Bodies of the captured knights were mutilated, beheaded, and crucified on makeshift crosses, and floated across the harbor as bloody warnings to the still defiant Christians. The Grand Master saw sight that was presented to them. He made his own reply. He took every Ottoman prisoner held by the knights, and he executed them. He then had their heads stuffed into cannons and fired them back into the Turkish lines. The message was received. The fall of St. Elmo was a tragedy, but it was also kind of a miracle of resistance. Because by holding out for so long, the defenders had actually ended up buying precious time. Time for the main fortifications to be strengthened. Time for hope of reinforcements from Sicily. Time to sap the strength of the Ottoman army. And as the last echoes of cannon fire faded from the shattered ruins of St. Elmo, both sides understood something deep in their bones. The real battle was just beginning.
Whispers in stone, blood in the rain, ash
And welcome back. By the way, that song will be releasing tonight on Spotify and all other great music places. So if you like it, seek out A Cosmic Bard over on your favorite music source. We move to Act 3. With Fort St. Elmo now reduced to a ruin, the Ottoman focus shifts entirely onto the knights' last two strongholds. Fortified towns of Burgu and Singleia, anchored by Fort St. Angelo and Fort St. Michael. Two narrow peninsulas jutting into the Grand Harbor. Two desperate clusters of defenders. One last stand. The Ottomans wheel their heavy artillery forward. They will dig their trenches, build their firing platforms, and lay siege lines tight around the forts. The knights, well, they will dig deeper, reinforce the wall, set traps, and prepare boiling oil and pitch. Everyone knows what's coming. No quarter, no surrender, no mercy. On July 15th, the Ottomans make their next big move. A two-pronged assault, carefully planned, perfectly executed, and almost brilliant. See, the Turks secretly haul 100 small boats overland to the calm side of the harbor behind Singleia. At dawn, they launch a surprise amphibious attack, aiming to hit the knights from behind. With 1,000 more Ottoman soldiers attack Fort St. Michael head-on from the landward side. It really is a classic pincher move. Hit them in front and in back, smash them flat, and open up harbor. Only one little problem with this plan. The Grand Master de Valette had gotten wind of this plan, because if there's one thing the knights are really, really, really good at, besides stabbing people with pointy ends, it was spying. De Valette had ordered emergency defenses built on Singleia's seaward side, spiked barriers, hidden cannon batteries, sharpened stakes in the shallows. So when the Ottoman flotilla came gliding in that morning, quiet, sneaky, full of soldiers ready to spill blood, they sailed right into a kill zone. The hidden cannons of Fort St. Angelo opened fire. Boom! 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 One shot after another ripped through the small boats like an angry god hurling lightning bolts. The water turned red. Bodies and wreckage floated where an invading army had been moments before. Of the 100 Ottoman boats, only one managed to limp back to safety. One out of the 100. Now imagine rolling up with your secret Navy SEAL team, and your grand surprise attack gets annihilated because some cranky old monks figured out how to hide some cannons behind some rocks. This really isn't just mission failed. This is you died before the tutorial ended levels of failure. But meanwhile, on land, the Ottomans launched a savage frontal assault on Fort St. Michael. Thousands charged forward under a hail of musket balls, of arrows, and of course that boiling pitch. But the outer walls crumbled, defenders would fall. Hand-to-hand combat raged across the breaches. For a moment, it seemed the Ottomans would break through. But yet, once again, the knights would rally. Reinforcements sprinted across a floating bridge from Burgu. Wounded men dragged themselves back onto the wall. Civilians, women, and children threw rocks and boiling water at the attackers. Somehow, by noon, Turks had been beaten back. It ended up being a slaughter for them. The Ottoman army had suffered another crushing defeat. And the tiny island fortress, well, that still stood. But the worst was yet to come. Through late July and early August, the siege turned into a nightmare. Constant bombardment, disease ripping through both camps, summer heat turning Malta into a baking hellscape. The air, it stank of death, and of gunpowder, and of rot. You see, there was no clean bandages left, no medicine, no food except salted meat and a little bit of hope. And still, the defenders did not break. They could not break. Then, a crazy, desperate move that might have saved everything. Knight Captain Vincenzo Anastaghi, commanding a small cavalry force up in Medina, decided he had enough sitting around. So he took about 100 horsemen, galloped straight into the lightly defended Ottoman field camp, and burned it to the ground. Not a very huge army, just, well, a handful of mounted lunatics that had torches at the ready. Now that raid caused chaos. Panic would ripple through the Turkish lines. Rumors began to spread that the long-awaited Christian relief force had arrived. The timing really couldn't have been any better. Because on the 7th of August, Mustafa Pasha had launched his greatest assault yet. Thousands began swarming Burgu and Singlea, reaching the outer defenses, fighting in the rubble. At one critical moment, the Ottoman standard was raised over a section of Burgu's walls. The Knights? Well, the Knights were on the verge of total collapse. But then, the Turks heard the shouts, the fires, the chaos in their rear. They thought an army was descending on their camp. They panicked. They broke off the assault. They fled back toward their ships. They actually abandoned the walls they had fought so hard to climb. The Knights of St. John held the line. Again. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't glamorous. But it was a victory. And perhaps for the first time, the most scary thought crept into their minds. The defenders started to believe. September 1565. The siege had dragged on for nearly 4 brutal, horrible months. The Ottoman forces, once so proud, so unstoppable, are now exhausted, half-starved, racked with dysentery, demoralized by defeat after defeat. And still, the Knights of Malta simply refused to fall. But the one thing neither side can ever win against: time. Time is running out for both sides. The Ottomans know it. The Knights know it. And then help arrives. On September 7th, 1565, the long-awaited Christian relief force, the Gran Soccorso, lands at St. Paul's Bay. With about 8,000 soldiers, Spaniards, Italians, Maltese volunteers, one and all, armed to the teeth, singing hymns and carrying the banners of Christendom. And they're also probably ready to punch an Ottoman or two just on general principle. When the word of this landing reached the Ottoman camp, Mustafa Pasha panicked. He orders a rapid retreat towards their ships. Siege guns are abandoned, tents burned. Wounded were left behind. The Ottomans are done. But then he began to second-guess himself. He realizes, even depleted, his forces still outnumber the fresh Christian troops. Maybe, just maybe, he can rally his men for one last battle, one last roll of the dice. And on September 11th, 1565, yes, we know that date and month very well, the Ottomans and the relief force decided to get it on. Outside the shattered villages near the bay, under a blazing sun, the two armies meet in open battle. The Christian troops, fresh, furious, fighting for Malta's survival, slam into the weary, sick, and desperate Ottoman soldiers. Cavalry charges shatter Ottoman lines. Knights in full armor hack their way forward, shouting battle cries that haven't been heard since the days of Jerusalem. The Ottoman army breaks completely. The retreat becomes a rout, and then a massacre. By nightfall, the survivors are scrambling onto ships, desperate to get away from the cursed island that devoured their strength, their pride, and their hope. Malta had held. The siege was over. But the island is now in ruin. Fields were burned, villages gutted, fortresses smashed to rubble. Of the original defenders, barely half survived. But Malta is free, and perhaps more importantly, Europe is safe. Grandmaster de Villette, the iron soul of Malta's defense, falls to his knees in the ruins of Bergy, raising his hands to the heaven and giving thanks to God. Not for survival, but for the honor of having stood firm. Europe erupts in celebration. Bells were ringing from Madrid to Rome to London. The Knights of Malta become legends, living proof that faith, courage, and brotherhood can stand triumphant against the most impossible of odds. Now, the cost was staggering. Over 10,000 Ottoman were dead. Thousands of more were wounded, sick, or missing. Half of Malta's civilian population were killed or displaced, and thousands of Christian soldiers were lost. Now, Malta didn't win because they were lucky. They won because, well, they outbled, outfought, and probably even outprayed the strongest empire on Earth. In this aftermath, with aid pouring in from Europe, the knights set to rebuilding. On the ruins of Mount Scibairis, they built a new fortified city, Valletta, named after the man who had led them through fire and death and into legend. Sadly, he would not live to see his city completed, for he died in 1568, but his spirit does remain in the stone walls and narrow streets. A monument to a faith that refused to fall. A fortress built by survivors. A warning to all tyrants, here we stand. The Siege of Malta had ended. The Ottomans had been repelled. Christian Europe had been saved for a time, and the echoes of that battle still permeate and ring through history. Now, while the guns have fallen silent, the banners have been lowered, and the ships have sailed away into history, we still know that Malta stands victorious. But even as the stones of Burgu and Singleia cooled under the Mediterranean sun, the deeper battle, the one that really matters, well, that never truly ended. Because while the armies change, the siege continues. In 1565, the Knights of St. John stood on the walls for Christianity, outnumbered, outgunned, half-starved. And they fought not just for themselves, but for something eternal. They fought for their faith, for their families, for a world where light could still have a place to shine. Now, today, the cannons are, of course, quieter. The swords have now been traded for words, for laws, for cultural battles waged in courtrooms and classrooms and the city streets instead of within the city walls. But if you think Christianity still isn't under siege, you haven't been paying attention. Look around. Faith is mocked. Truth is twisted. Morality is ridiculed. There are still places in this world where Christians face real persecution, prison, exile, even death. And here, in lands that once rang with church bells at every hour, the slow siege of cynicism and secularism chips away at the fortress walls. They tell you to kneel. They tell you to compromise, to make peace with the world, no matter the cost. But the lesson of Malta is clear. Do not yield. When the enemy surrounds you, when the walls are battered, and every voice tells you it's hopeless, that is when you need to stand tall. Because what matters most, what's worth fighting for, well, it was never supposed to be easy to defend. John de Valette and his knights didn't hold Malta because they thought they could win. They held it because it was right. Because surrender meant something even worse than death. It meant the loss of their soul. And today, whether you're defending your faith in a hostile room, raising your children to know truth in a world that lies, or simply holding on to hope when everyone around you calls you a fool, you're standing on your own walls. Let me tell you something. If a few hundred bloodied knights could stand against the greatest empire on earth, then you, armed with faith, fortified by grace, can stand too. I want to thank everyone for joining me tonight. For once again walking into the shadows of history to find the fire that still burns today. This has been a great episode, premiere season 4, episode 61 of In the Crease. I thank you all for tuning in, when and however you do. I am your host, JE and I will see you next time in 2 weeks, where we'll dive deeper into the stories that shaped us, challenged us, or God knows what. Until then, if you have the faith, hold your faith like a sword, guard your hope like a fortress, and never, ever. Good night, my friends.